All right, well, it's just gone 12 o'clock and looks like we've got a good turnout for the first in the Trimester 2 Centre for Governance and Public Policy seminar series here at Griffith University. And it's my pleasure today to welcome Dr. Katrine Beauregard to be the first speaker for the series. Katrine is an ARC DECRA Fellow and a Senior Lecturer in the School of Politics and International Relations at the ANU. Katrine has a PhD from the University of Calgary, and she did her master's and undergraduate training at the Université de Montréal. Katrine's research focuses on women's representation and underrepresentation in particular in politics. Her recent research has looked at some really interesting dimensions of this topic, the issue of gender quotas in parties, women's representation in conservative parties, and also she's done some work on the role of feminism in sovereigntist movements in Quebec, which I find really fascinating. Katrine is published in some of the key international outlets in our field, including Political Psychology, the Journal of Women, Politics and Policy, Political Research Quarterly, and the Australian Journal of Political Science. Katrine and I were just talking before the start of the seminar, and she and I share a bit of Quebecois heritage, and we've also both toughed out several Albertan winters. Duncan was complaining before about how cold it is, but we'll have no complaints about the how cold it is in Brisbane today. Thank you very much. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Katrine, who'll speak for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we'll have questions. And as per the usual practice, I'll invite those who have comments or questions to signal that in the chat, and then we'll go through those in order. So over to you, Katrine.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. So for today, what I want to basically talk about is some of the DECRA findings that I'm currently working on. So basically, just to give you a big, easy summaries of what my DECRA is about, is basically to look to the role of political parties in contributing to underrepresentation of women in politics. The first big question I'm asking is basically, do political parties represent women and men? And then the second, basically, half of the project is basically look at the consequences that if there's difference in representation, what are the consequences for men and women political participation more broadly. But for today, I'm just going to basically talk a little bit about the first part, which is about the role of political parties in representing men and women differently. And if there's difference, basically what are they? So to talk about representation by political party, I basically kind of qualified what political parties do into three broad categories. So basically what political parties' role is, first off, is to mobilize voters during election, organize electoral choices. Second function that political parties a lot of times perform is that they try to include citizens in the decision-making process. And the third function that they perform is recruiting political leadership. And the general argument, this for the DECRA project, but also the book project I'm working on right now, is that by basically fulfilling these functions, political parties make choices about who they mobilize, which interests and which citizens get to be included in the decision-making process, and who they represent and who they recruit for political leadership. And by making these decisions, they can actually favor some groups over the other. And that can contribute to the underrepresentation of women here. So for today's presentation, I'm going to basically just focus on the second part, which is the chapter I'm currently working on, which is about including citizens in the decision-making process. So I'm going to basically just preamble by saying that this is very much works in progress, that I'm still gathering data about this, but I've tried to be a good basic opportunity to get some feedback into where this is going. So I'm really looking forward to your question and your suggestion about what to think about moving the project or this book, basically this book chapter 4. So like I said, basically I'm interested into, for this part, just in the inclusion process of citizens. So a big thing that political parties' functional role in society is to include citizens in the decision-making process. And they do so by basically a process of articulating and aggregating political interest in their party platform and later in government. And again, just to simplify, because it's only 30 minutes, I'm just going to talk about basically the process of inclusion in the party platform or the manifestos, the document that political parties bring to election here, right? And political parties cannot basically represent every citizen's interest into their platform. They again need to make choices. And the argument that I'm making is that by deciding who gets which issues, preferences get to be included and aggregated, political parties can represent more or less well women and men differently. So basically the existing literature on the party priorities, and I'm basically just focusing on the platform. The existing literature basically says that political party tends to be more likely to represent the concern and the interest of male, educated, and affluent citizens. So this can be some biases in what kind of interests are put forward by political parties. So there's generally two explanations for it. The first one is that there's basically an underrepresentation of some groups inside political parties. So if we think about party members, they generally tends to be male, well-educated, more affluent citizens. If we look at party organization, right, who's volunteering or who has jobs inside political parties, who is the political staff, again, we see important differences into who's here. And if we go up the ladder from volunteers up until who gets to be elected, who gets to be selected, who gets to be MP, who gets to be party leaders, again, there's this bias towards male, educated, affluent citizens. So basically the argument or the explanation is that basically to have your interest be represented, you need to be inside the political parties. And if there's some groups who are not inside political parties, then one of the consequences will be is that their interests are not represented during this aggregation and decision about which policy political parties are going to put forward in their platform. So that's generally the first set of explanation. The second set of explanation focuses on basically resources, so a level of resources, is that political parties might not be reflecting the concern of women, less educated, less influences, and because these are the citizens that are less likely to participate in politics. So for a very long time, women were less likely than men to turn out, so that has changed. So in most countries, nowadays, women vote in the same proportion as men, but there's still some differences in terms of more educated, more affluent citizens will actually be more likely to turn out in voluntary system of voting. But not just voting, you can see also important differences, gender differences in terms of other forms of political participation, such as basically contacting politicians, writing letters, organizing groups, or organizing pressure or community organization to actually put forward issues or preferences into the political sphere. We generally see that there's also important gender gaps into these kind of types of activities. And even if you ask questions such as interest in politics, who feel more efficacious will be able to impact politics more, men more than women tends to be more active, right? So this is basically a general argument, is that women don't have the resources or have less resources to be involved in politics and might not be perceived by political parties as active in politics, right? And if your goal is to basically get elected as a political parties, your incentive might be to reflect the interests of the people who actually are going to be active. So if you're under a voluntary electoral system, your incentive as a political party might be more to respond to the interest of the people you perceive to be involved in politics and active in politics and will turn out for you, which might be a concern of male, educated, and affluent citizens, right? And in some countries, for example, where actually contribution is quite important, right? So being able to give money to political parties can actually be associated with an impact on the types of policies these parties put forward. If there's an important gender gap in income, for example, that might defavorize women, right? So that's basically to recap, right? Parties might put forward concern or reflect the, sorry, let me rephrase that. So the parties' platforms and interests that they put forward during the election might reflect the concern of more active citizens, and they might be perceiving men more than women to actually be active for it. But I mean, and then what I'm trying to test here is basically, is that there might be some incentive for political parties to basically change their behavior and try to reach out to underrepresented groups, are sometimes being referred to under-tapped groups for electoral reason. So Rosie Campbell in the UK actually have found that political parties can be more likely to address women's issue during election if they think that they actually can win women's votes. So this is the idea that the gender gap matters in politics. It's the gender gap in vote choice will matter. It's something that politicians talks about, something the media talks about. It's most politician or politics or parties are really aware of that there might be a gap in terms of their voting. So it might be the case that if political parties wants to attract more women voters, they might do so by paying more attention to what is being defined as actually women issue. Or it can also be the case that if actually there's a large gender gap inside of political parties, right? So generally speaking, left-wing political parties have more female voters. Political parties might be wanting to keep those voters and respond to their demand by changing their party priorities. Right, and also in a comparative study in the Europe, so Dinkler, Koberg, and Fortin Rittberger actually have found that that's not parties per se, but countries. So in countries where women participate more, so there's more women who actually turn out to vote, there's a better reflection in terms of policy of it. So it does basically kind of indicate that there might be electoral incentives that will bring political parties to actually reflect better women's priority, and in countries where there's more active participation of women, they might be a more responsive from political party here. Right, so more specifically, what I'm interested in testing in this presentation and the data I'm showing to you is basically the idea that there are actually gender gaps in public opinion. So there's a large literature in multiple countries that basically show that, generally speaking, women tend to be more favorable to welfare state, expanding welfare state. They're more favorable to government intervention, more generally favored to what's called social justice issue, like achieving equality between men and women, but also kind of between different groups, right? So this gender gap in public opinion has been found, but what is actually quite interesting is that this gender gap can vary across political party supporter. So a lot of the research has basically just looked at basically, if you want, at the country level to say that in Australia, women like welfare better than men, or are more supportive of gender quota than men. But if we break this down by political parties, we see variation in terms of gender gap. So if you just look at the supporter for each political parties, we can see this here. So that's fine, something I find in Australia, but also been found kind of in other country here. So then the first kind of a question I'm asking in this presentation is that if we do have a gender gap in terms of supporter of political parties, who is the party gonna actually try to represent more, right? So if men and women basically have the same political opinions, right, there's not much incentive for political parties to be more attractive for women, right, to actually be present or to support more welfare policy or more social policy or more gender equality policy if men and women basically are quite happy where they are. But if there's important gender gaps, right, if women and men want kind of different things in terms of public policy inside of political parties, right, who basically kind of wins out here is the first kind of question here. So the second one that I'm interested in is just simply the size of the gender gap. So basically, right? So if we have a difference into the types of policy, and if you have a difference in terms of support for political parties, right? Will political parties be more likely to represent men if they have more men supporters, or will they be more likely to represent women if they have more, basically more women supporters? Generally speaking, the cross-national research basically tends to show that in established democracies, there's a gender gap with women actually preferring left-wing political parties and men preferring right-wing political parties. But then I'll show you a bit of data a bit later on that basically so that actually this might be a bit more complicated than that there's actually much more variation in terms of gender gap. So that might be a way of actually for women to be better represented is that they, by being basically an electoral constituents that the political parties wants to attract. Finding the role of basically women's representation, right? This is the idea that if you actually have more women inside of political parties, it can change the types of party priorities, right? So previous studies have found that if you actually have more women who are elected from a political party, the political parties, generally speaking, become more left-wing, right? There's greater emphasis on social justice issues like equality between women and men, but also different types of equality, right? If gender quotas are adopted, that also shift basically parties' priorities towards more like women actually prefer. And if you have a woman as a party leader, we actually see also a change in actually party priorities. So here, basically, the hypothesis I'm laying out is that there might be an interaction impact between the presence of women, like women's representation inside of political parties, and basically what the supporter wants. So it might be easier for, if there's a strong gender gaps in public opinion and then gender gaps in voting, for this gender gaps to be reflected in the party priorities if there's women inside political parties who are there to advocate it for other women. So if there's no women's representation, it might not matter less if there's a gender gap in vote choice or a gender gap in preferences. So what I'm actually basically, how I'm testing basically these hypotheses. So I'm basically merging two data sets. So for the data from the actual on the gender gaps, basically I'm using the comparative study of electoral system, the integrated module from 1996 to 2016. So that's basically is a collection of national election studies in multiple democracies and less so democracies from across the world. And basically I have a lot, basically provides a lot of actual data from individual level opinion. So consistently the CSCS actually ask basically the position, your left-right position on basically a scale of 0 mean left, 10 means right. And that basically is a consistent measure across all surveys. So that basically allows us it allows me to actually measure basically if there's a gap between the median position of supporters, of male and female supporters. That allows me to basically measure a gap. Ideally, you would have to have basically actual policy position, like do you favor welfare state, do you favor spending on childcare, etc. But it's really hard to find consistent basically data across country and over years to be able to basically test the hypothesis that I do. So basically the best kind of measure of gender gap in public opinion is basically this position, left-right position on the 0 to 10 scale. And then also have percentage of women and men who have voted for each political parties. Again, it's a common question, who do you vote for at each election? So that's quite easy data to obtain. And for basically party priorities, I'm using the manifesto manifesto project data set from the same years as the comparative study of electoral system. There's data going back before 1996 in the manifesto project data set, but I don't have the the individual level data to match it with. So I just kind of limit my analysis to those 20 years that overlap between the two data sets. And to measure party priorities that might be more favorable to women, I basically follow previous studies, and basically have identified basically 3-4 categories in the project manifesto data set that are basically associated with what actually women's preference are interested in. So the project manifesto data set basically code party platform across at each election for each political parties, and tell us how much of these platforms are devoted to these categories. And basically to measure women's priorities, I pick basically a percentage that is devoted to social justice issue that include basically favorizing basically a distribution of resources and of any types of discrimination between women and men, but also between gender, between sex, religion, class, race, ethnicity, etc. So then the second one is basically welfare expansion. So basically the proportion of the manifesto that is devoted, that is favorable to the welfare state and wants to spend more money on the welfare state. Proportion of the manifesto that are about education, so expansion of education, spending on education as positive. And then I use the basically a measure that's basically favorable mention of non-economic demographic groups. So that's basically anything that doesn't fit into the previous category. That is a positive mention of basically women, but also other groups such as age, that is not specifically demographic, like such as ethnic groups, racial groups, etc. That basically might be an indication of basically we considering these groups as to be important, and we want to attract their support. And then finally, I use the project manifesto data set has overall measure of left-right position of the political parties that basically adds all these different kind of measure that they have, and they come up with a cumulative position of where this political parties stand on the left and right. And basically by combining these and by using these variables, I ended up with basically 32 countries that are included in my data set, with data ranging from, like I said, 1996 to 2016. It's important to know that basically for some countries, I have basically two elections, and for other countries, I might have 4. So for Australia and Canada, for example, I have 4 elections in this time period, but for Belgium, I have only 2 elections, right? So there's some variation in terms of number of elections per country that is included that might actually affect my results. I'll talk a little bit about it later. And for women's representation, I used percentage of women who is member of parliament by political party, and whether a political party has a female leader. Unfortunately, I do not have data on the quota, so some political parties have adopted gender quotas, so that might be one of measure of women's representation. So I don't have the data right now. However, RA is currently working on it and collecting this data, so I cannot actually present this to you today, but I'll focus on the 2 others, which I actually have data here. So I'll just make a bit. So here is just basically a descriptive representation of the gender gap in vote choice across a basically party family, right? From from green political parties to agrarian and ethnic political parties and special issue. And if and the gap is simply basically percentage of women who supported a political party minus percentage of men who voted for that political party. So if the gap is above 0, there's more women supporting the party. If it's below 0, there's more men supporting political party. So generally speaking, we would expect that to see positive gap for left-wing political parties and negative gap for more right-wing political parties such as liberal, conservative, nationalist political parties. That's basically what we observe here, but these are just box plots that basically show you the distribution in each, and we do see some kind of interesting distribution here. So we do have basically left-wing political parties who have a negative gender gap, who have more male supporters than female supporters in our data set here. Same thing with social democratic political parties, right? Social democratic parties seem to be quite nicely split up, is that we do have positive and negative gender gap. Same thing with more liberal, like liberals or Christian Democrats tend to have a lot of positive gender gap, where more female supporters than men supporters, and conservative political parties again are quite also evenly split up. So it's not the case that in my data set like all left political parties have more women supported, and all right political parties have more men supporters. It's actually quite an interesting gender gap here in party family. Here, that's just the gender gap in left-right position. And basically the way to read this gap, to read this graph, is basically it's a bunch of zeros, right? So for most political parties in my data set, there's actually not many, there's no differences between women supporters and men supporters position on the left and right. So it does seem to be that generally speaking, supporters of a political party tend to agree on where they are in the left and right spectra. So basically those dots that we see here for the more left wing, we call it for green parties, left parties, are just basically outliers. But for most the gender gap is quite zero with some slight variation. So liberal Christian Democrats and Nationalist Party, for example, you see a little bit more of gender gaps where men are more right-wing than female supporters. But generally speaking, here there's much less variation on the left-right position than there are variation on the gap in vote choice. And here is basically just distribution of basically scores on the manifesto data set for social justice, welfare system, education expansion, and favorable mention across each party families, just to actually show again that we do have some interesting kind of variation, especially for welfare system, is that it's not really much the case that only left political parties are more supportive of welfare states. We do see some very similar score distribution for more conservative, nationalist and liberal political parties who do see. So we do have basically just trying to show that there's some kind of interesting variation, that not all political parties in the same family are similar when it comes to priorities itself. So there's something left to explain here. And then finally here is just the general left-right position according to their composite measure providing by the party manifesto data set. And generally speaking, we can see that left-wing political parties will be more left. So basically, if you have a score below 0, it's a left, you're more left-wing. If you have a political party score above 0, you're more actually right-wing here. So we do see a lot more below 0 for Green Party, Left Party, Social Democratic Party. And then a Liberal Party are quite around, nicely centered around the 0. Some of them are right, some of them are left. And as you move more right, you see more right political party. Okay, so result. So basically here I have my dependent variables, which are the party platform. So size devoted, how much percentage of the platform is devoted to social justice issue, welfare, education, favored motion, and then the left-right issue. So the first two variable, basically what's the impact of having women in P. So that's a lag variable. So that taking at the previous election. So if you have more women elected, so does that change? Does that affect your party platform at the next election? The answer is basically no, with the exception of this left-right measure. So if you have more women MPs, right, at the next election, your political party is more actually left. There's very little impact of having a women leader, right? The only significant result of having a women leader is for education, which seemed to decrease the attention devoted to positive mention of education. I'm a bit kind of not sure what that means, probably just a random issue. Then I have, the next few variables just basically control. So I control for the percentage of vote at the previous election, and I only control for left parties, which is left and social democratic parties and green parties. But if I put the full range of party family that I've shown, it doesn't really change the results. I would just try to be parsimonious here and just have a limited set of party control here. But then if we move to the next two, it's basically the test for the gender gap, right? So if you have a gender gap at the previous election, again, these are lag variable in the left and right, it doesn't really impact the parties. There's nothing significant here. The party priorities does not change. But if there's a gender gap in the previous election in vote choice, then we see some actually significant result here. So for political parties who have more women supporters than men supporters, right? These parties at the next election have devoted more attention to welfare issue, more attention to education issue, and they're generally speaking more left-wing than other political party. So the next slide here in the next set of results basically just tests this interaction impact. So the previous slide, there was no impact of women's representation, but it might be, we might have an interaction between women's representation and vote choice and gender gap, but then the results here are basically, nothing is significant here. There doesn't seem to be having any impact of women's representation or having here. Okay, so just quickly finish up, I'll use my last basically 5 minutes to basically kind of question a little bit my finding here. It does seem to be that political parties with more women's supporters will have different party priorities. So here the question basically, it could be two things, right? It could be parties are responding, right? They are, oh, we have more women supporters, we're going to be adjusting our parties' priorities by supporting welfare more, by supporting education, by being, generally speaking, more left-wing. Or it can simply be that women prefer parties who talk more about welfare, education, or generally speaking more left-wing, regardless of party family. So to be able to test if I have this basically is there a responsiveness of political parties, right? I can basically leverage my data set where for the countries that I have multiple consecutive election, right? So that does reduce my number of countries and my number of observation. But for the countries where I actually have consecutive election, I can test the impact of increasing your women's vote, increasing your male vote on change in party policy. So this is basically what I do here. Here, the dependent variable is a bit different, is that from one election to the next, it's the change into how much you spent devoted to justice issue, social justice issue, welfare issue, education issue, other groups, and whether or not you change your overall left-right position. And then my dependent variable is the previous change in women's vote and men's vote. And here, basically, I found basically nothing, right? So gaining women voters is not associated with changing your policy. Gaining men voters, again, is not associated with any shape or form changing your party policy. So same thing here for the, basically if your supporters change in their left-right orientation, are political party responding by changing their platform? Here, the answer again is a big no. All right, and basically here the test of possibility that's not so much changing or gaining men and women's vote, is basically changing in the proportion, right? So the gap, right? So I gain men's vote, but if I gain women's vote, it doesn't change my gender gap. What might be more important here is changing of the gap, right? So basically it can be two different change, right? I can change my gender gap by increasing my proportion of men versus my proportion of women, or I can change my gender gap by increasing my proportion of women by changing versus my proportion of men. But again, I basically found no responsiveness of political party. So in conclusion, I do actually kind of find some interesting findings that when there is larger gender gap in vote choice, right, where you have more women voters, supporters of a political party, than you have men supporters of political party, these tend to be associated with different party priorities, right? Greater attention to welfare, education, and more generally, left wing, and that actually is control for party ideology, right? So that's actually quite interesting here. But I'm not quite sure if it's an effect that is basically parties are trying to responsive to voters, just simply that generally speaking, it's the women that are just like these political parties better, regardless of left and right. If you have a party that talks about welfare, you just like that party. You vote for that party more. And there's quite a note again on the types of data that I have is don't have very much repetitive country, right? So basically the way I write it down in the slides is that it's more of a cross political party than it is a within political party analysis, which basically means because of the CESCS data that I'm merging with the manifesto data, I don't have a lot of repetitive observation for a same country that is consecutive. So might be one of the reasons why I found nothing in my responsiveness test to see if changing the vote or change of vote choice, change party platform is just maybe simply that I don't have enough observation. Like I've mentioned when I was talking about data, the number of countries that are reading more than 2 elections consecutively in my data set is quite small, so that might actually impact why we don't see things. So it's much better to, I think the bigger conclusion here seems to be that it is something about there is a relationship between who support the political parties and what their party priority are. I'm a bit kind of still trying to wrap my around how significant or what's the meaning of this. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your question and comments.
Thank you very much, Katrine, for a fascinating presentation. We've already got people lining up to ask questions, and I'm going to start with Farhan.